Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Hello, Encora, and welcome to the kickoff for Ascend. This is our first ever employee resource group. We have got an amazing time planned and a historic time planned for Encora. But first, I want to know, are you ready for takeoff? Countdown, countdown. Welcome, Encora. Welcome back. For those of you who may not know, I'm Tracy Thomas. I'm Associate General Counsel here at Encora, but also Associate Chair of our D&I Committee, inclusively Encora, which is chaired by our CAO, Dawn Landry. I'm thrilled to be here with you today, and I want to thank all of you for joining us as well. We have an exciting lineup coming up, an amazing keynote speaker, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. So be sure to visit the Q&A tab so you can get those questions in. But up next, I want to introduce someone that really needs no introduction. He has been in the ranks of aerospace leadership for over 20 years. And from day one, he's been one of the very first supporters of our D&I Council. I'm really excited about who's coming to the stage. He's been at the forefront and very vocal about how much D&I initiatives mean to him. And he truly is our male ally, CEO David Khalil.
And Tracy, you're too kind, and you're just doing a wonderful job on the MC side. So I'm going to bring you to all my events. So, but let me first just start by thanking MACE for her service to our country. My father was a navigator in B-24s in World War II, so I have just a huge regard for people that serve our country. And I think in this day and age, they don't get enough credit for giving us the freedom every day to drive to work and complain about traffic when they're risking their lives in foreign countries. I think for me personally, the reason why this is important, my family had a long line of very strong women. You know, my mother got her PhD at 74 after she finished her career. My sisters are very accomplished. One of them is the highest ranking female civilian at Tyndall Air Force Base. And then with my wife being an executive and my daughter working on her PhD at 25. So I've always been surrounded by strong women, very much, never insecure about it, really appreciate talented women in all aspects of life. So I really appreciate Tracy and the team here really putting this forth. I think it shows our commitment to this. I was a sponsor at my last company for women in leadership. So this Women in Aviation for me is important because we want to make sure that we promote and give those channels of opportunity. And look, it's all about talent, right? I think when you hear MACE, I mean, this is about, the oyster, the world's your oyster, as long as we clear roadblocks, I think you guys can achieve, anything you want in this world. So really appreciate the team's effort here. Appreciate the team that's going to talk next. And I appreciate all the ELT support you're going to see here. So I think next I'm turning it over to, I think, is it Mark? Is that right? Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, look, this is super exciting. And what an honor to be the executive sponsor for Ascend, our first employee resource group. Aerospace, like a lot of industries, is highly reliant on a talent pool from what we call the STEMs, the STEM industries or studies, the science, technology, engineering, and math. And women in aerospace have historically been underrepresented here, and their contributions have been minimized. So this is a critically important effort for us to overcome those barriers. The growing recognition of the importance of gender diversity and inclusion in aerospace has led to some really positive but slow changes. So what we're interested in is how do we progress in providing greater leadership opportunities for women and ensuring that that Ascend is going to be one of those vehicles to do so, to accelerate that for Ancora and the industry. Kind of like your comments, David. I mean, this is important to me is, I saw and am the product of a lot of exceptional women leaders, from teachers that really, took me under their wing, to my mother, who came here to this country and not speaking English, finished school just like yours, and was a leader in just being kind and loving, showing people the potential of who they could become, and that's been an inspiration to me really all my life. So we hope that Ascend becomes that resource for the community, for professional development, for change, and a platform for organizational feedback. So we've already had a number of employees join the Ascend network, and it continues to grow. So we're very excited about that, and all the advocates that are going to be part of this great effort. So I'll hand over to Daniel and Elizabeth, who'll be running our U.S. and rest of world regional Ascend groups. Daniel.
Thanks, Mark. I'm especially honored just to even be nominated to join the Ascend group, let alone help and lead drive actions for the Americas teams. I've been with this company now for 15 years, and I've had the pleasure of working with and for some amazing women in some very senior positions. And as a company, I truly believe it's vital that we lead the journey. And I especially recognize my role in helping guide and lead the Americas team to organize events, organize opportunities, bring opportunities for mentorship, for leadership, for recruitment. And I'm really excited for this kickoff. I'm eager to pull the team together, and I'm thankful ahead of time for all the volunteers that have already reached out to join and support this movement. So, and I'll hand it over to Elizabeth for the rest of the role comments.
Thank you, Daniel. It's clear to us that when an organisation invests in a professional environment with employees of different backgrounds, different strengths, experiences and knowledge, it means that there will be an increase in innovative ideas and creative outputs. By having an inclusive and diverse setting, Ancora allows for a wider perspectives to be heard and integrated when problem solving, and this can then develop into new business strategies for the organisation. There is a broad evidence base to suggest that there is a huge relationship between diversity on an executive level within an organisation and the likelihood of higher financial performance. And this has only strengthened over time. Therefore, as Ancora, we see a significant benefit in creating a culture of gender diversity within the organisation. And on that note, I'd like to hand back to Mark, our executive sponsor.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Elizabeth. So now I have the privilege of introducing our special guest and speaker. So have you ever wished you had the confidence of Maverick and Top Gun? I know it's one of my favorite movies. And our next speaker has broken the speed of sound and broken barriers. She has spent over a decade flying high performance fighter aircraft, including 3 years as a pilot for the Air Force Thunderbirds and a combat tour in Afghanistan. So what is the key to finding the courage to succeed at this level? It's likely not what you think. Here to share her stories of how she became her biggest adversary, her own voice of self-doubt, please welcome to the stage, Michelle MACE Curran.
Thank you, Mark. And before I get into my portion, I just want to say how happy I am to be here and honored to be kind of kicking off this program. Just listening to your remarks and your priorities as you set it all up, that just says so much about the company. So I'm excited to join you. And before I get into my formal portion, I have a hype video because I feel like everyone needs a good hype video. And it's 6 in the morning my time, so I need my hype video as well. So let's watch that.
The only female pilot. Please welcome Major Michelle Curran of the United States Air Force Thunderbird.
Michelle MACE Curran.
I love watching all your reactions, even on camera with muted. It's awesome to see. So before I introduce myself any further, I do actually have a question for all of you. And I'm feeling a lot better about this in light of recent events. It used to date me a little bit. But let me get a round of applause. So a round of applause via your reaction button if you have seen either Top Gun movie. I'm going to give it a second because they're all going to roll in because I know almost everyone has seen it. It's incredible. Every audience I get in front of, almost every person. Thank you, Tom Cruise, for that. If you've seen Top Gun, then you know a little bit about fighter pilot culture, or at least Hollywood's portrayal of it. And you know that we tend to have nicknames that we refer to as call signs. So you have Goose, you have Maverick, and you have Mace. So I'm Michelle Mace Curran, and no, my parents were not cool enough to give me a badass middle name, but that's the call sign that I was given at my first combat squadron. And fighter pilot call signs, they tend to sound at least a little cool, but most of us will keep the story of how we earned ours pretty close hold. And that's because you don't get to pick it, but it's given to you based on a mistake that you made as a young pilot. And while that one mistake would surely not be your last, it would be the one that determined what you went by for the rest of your career. So my career, it spanned 13 years on active duty, flying the F-16 the entire time. And I got to do that all over the world, from Europe to Asia to the Middle East. And the last 3 years, I was part of an incredible team, the Air Force Thunderbirds. We had some unique opportunities with the Thunderbirds. When you're new to the team, they realize you're not used to being in the public spotlight, and that type of the job, or that part of the job, can be stressful. So they like to ease you into those types of situations. So my first event for the public ever, it wasn't even an air show. It was just a flyover for the Super Bowl. Are you serious? 100 million people are watching. If you saw the Super Bowl that year, this was back in 2019 in Atlanta, this is a formation that you would have seen. What we call the Delta, when all 6 jets are flying close together, as close as 18 inches apart. And when someone says Air Force Thunderbirds, this is what they think of. But these 6 jets and 6 pilots are just the tip of the iceberg. Behind them, there's a team of 130 people, all working towards a common goal. All very talented, very motivated, but despite their individual talents, there's not a single one of them that alone could have the impact that that team has as a whole. So the role that I had the honor of playing was a solo pilot. What that means is I did get to fly in these beautiful formations. In this photo, I'm actually in the far left aircraft, but I also got to split off and do single aircraft maneuvers to really showcase what the F-16 can do. So I'm going to show you one of them. Maneuvers like this one. Even through just the camera, some of you look like you're going to throw up. And I know if the reactions had the little pukey face emoji, that there'd be a bunch of those popping up. But that was called vertical rolls, and it was my favorite to fly. I got to come in at 100 feet above the ground, or in this case, the ocean, at 600 miles an hour, 600. And then in that turn, I would pull 8 to 9 Gs. We're going to talk a bunch about Gs here in a minute. But then I would spiral up to 15,000 feet in just a few seconds. And my favorite part of this maneuver is the snapshot you see right there, where I got to look back over my shoulder and see that white spiral of smoke, showing where I had started and how far I had come in such a short amount of time. It was a surreal perspective every flight. So the flying that I got to do with the Thunderbirds, hands down the most fun of my career. But there was actually a part of that job that I realized that I enjoyed even more. And that was being in a position where I could inspire other people. This was unexpected. Putting on that blue suit overnight, I found myself in a spot where I could inspire others to work with the people next to them towards a common goal, to overcome obstacles, or to chase down whatever their big dream was. And that was the most rewarding thing I had ever experienced. So as a Thunderbird pilot, your flying skills are important for obvious reasons, but nearly as important are your people skills. You're an ambassador for the Air Force. It's a very public-facing position. But I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I am an introvert, and that part was not natural for me. Growing up, I was an incredibly shy kid, also a very awkward one, but we can save that for the Q&A. In school, I would play what I called the eye contact game, which is where the teacher asks the question, no one raises their hand. But of course, they're still going to call on someone. I did not want that to be me. So when that would happen, I would turn into a toddler learning to play hide and seek for the first time. If I can't see her, she can't see me, and I would stare at the floor. That's the eye contact game. And now I'm realizing not a lot of skill was required, but I was definitely the MVP. The idea of being put on the spot in front of my peers felt vulnerable and exposed and uncomfortable, so I tried to avoid it. Maybe some of you can relate. I think if you were to ask yourself if you've ever felt nervous or anxious, felt that feeling in the pit of your stomach because you were worried that you might not live up to the expectations that others had for you, I think everyone could reflect on a time in their life that they've been there. And Psychology Today found that 85% of adults struggle with low self-esteem and self-doubt. 85%, which I found shocking. And if you're in the 15% that doesn't, I definitely applaud you, but keep in mind that person to your left or to your right that works with you or works for you, they likely do. And that doubt, it can cost you. And I mean money. So the University of Messina found that blue collar workers with low self-esteem made as much as $7,000 less per year than their peers. And white collar workers, $28,000 less annually in 1 year. So if you think about that over a lifetime, over a career, that's over $1 million because of our own doubt. And what I thought is interesting about something that can have such an impact on both our personal and our professional lives is that it's not always visible on the outside. We tend to look at people in a position we view as successful and think that they have it all figured out. They possess some magical attribute that we don't have. Maybe they were born with it or they picked it up along the way. Whatever it is, it's allowed them to smoothly sail along, always being sure of themselves, always knowing what to do. But the minute we start to think that way, we create a gap between what they have accomplished and what we see as possible for ourselves. So if you fall into that mentality of giving those you admire halos, I'm thinking that the peek behind the curtain I'm about to give you will show you just how wrong that assumption can be. There's a key to finding more than just inspiration in those we admire. And it's the same key to move you from just thinking about your goals to actually taking action toward them. We talk about the fear of failure, but it's a fear of vulnerability that leads to missed opportunities and limits our potential. We hate putting ourselves out there. Think about a time you've been in a meeting and you had a great idea, but you never raised your hand and shared it. Or maybe you've been out at a networking event and you saw someone across the room that you knew you should go introduce yourself to, but you never went and said hi. Putting ourselves out there, it can be terrifying. But I promise you the cost of stagnating, of getting stuck because of that fear, outweighs the discomfort that comes with vulnerability. Most of my career, even occasionally while the lead solo for the Thunderbirds, I was sure that at any moment everyone else is going to figure out what I already knew. That I wasn't as good of a pilot as they thought I was, that I wasn't as smart as they thought I was, and that I wasn't a good teammate. Meanwhile, on the outside, I'm at the pinnacle of success. I'd set this goal, worked towards it relentlessly, and I had achieved it. So why then was I filled with this doubt? The human brain is a strange place. We love to dwell on the negatives. It goes back to primitive times where we had a negative interaction with something like a saber-toothed tiger. You better remember that so it's burned into your mind so you could avoid it in the future, because Darwinism. But in modern times, this tendency, it can really hold us back. Now, a place that I've experienced this, that I'm sure several of you have as well, social media. One of the cool things that I got to do while I was flying for the Thunderbirds is record those cockpit videos like the one you saw and share them online. People loved them. They would get thousands of likes, hundreds of positive comments. And then there would be that one negative comment. looking a little wide in formation, or me being the only woman flying for the team at the time, another empty kitchen. Can she even parallel park? And no one knows how they're supposed to react when I share those. And my husband would say I'm a terrible parallel parker, but I have a hard time repeating those comments with a straight face because we realize that the people that make comments like that, their credibility, very low. But at the end of the day, I would find myself telling my husband not about the hundreds of positive comments, but about the one negative one and how it was still bothering me. We like to think that high achievers are bulletproof to comments like these. But just because you found success, it doesn't make you immune to the opinions of others or to your own voice of doubt. In 2012, I arrived at my first combat squadron in Misawa, Japan. When I got there, I rapidly discovered that being a good fighter pilot went well beyond the left hand, right hand of flying an airplane. It involved multitasking at an extreme level, thinking 10 steps ahead. It was far more technical and complicated than I had ever imagined. As I got settled in Japan, it was time to start flying. My first mission in country is what you would know as dogfighting. One aircraft versus another, where my sole goal in life is to get that other airplane in front of mine so I can employ weapons against it. Now, this was still a training flight. It was my instructor in the other jet, and I had done this mission when I was first learning to fly the F-16. But when you're a new fighter pilot, things are happening fast. I'm talking 500 miles an hour fast, and your brain, it just can't keep up. It's very easy to get fixated on one thing and lose track of others. It comes with time and experience where you can manage all of that. Then you add on top of that G forces. Now, I promised I would dive into G's a little bit. Right now, we're all at 1G, the force of gravity. You weigh whatever you weigh on your bathroom scale. So, for example, let's say I weigh 100 pounds because A, math in public, and B, no one likes to embarrass themselves. If I was to weigh 100 pounds under 9 Gs, which is what the F-16 is capable of, I would feel like I weighed 900 pounds. And let's be honest, your average fighter pilot being between 150 and 200 pounds, we're talking about 1,500 pounds of force pushing you down into the seat. Under those conditions, it's hard to focus, it's hard to breathe, and it's hard to stay conscious. You can go from this is me over a decade ago, very baby-faced, about to try my hand at 9 Gs for the first time, to this in a split second. Not even Botox can save you. The G's are pushing from your head towards your feet, and they are much stronger than your heart's ability to pump blood to your brain. And when the blood gets forced out of your head, lights out. A G-induced loss of consciousness known as a G-lock. And it's a serious threat. So keep those beautiful photos in mind as you think about the dogfight that day. As that fight started, I knew what I was supposed to do. I had done this before. I should push the throttle all the way up, light the afterburner. Let the jet accelerate for just a few seconds before rolling to the right and pulling back on the stick. Now, I knew I would hit 9 Gs, but I also knew that quickly the jet would start to slow down, the Gs would drop a little bit, I'd be able to turn, point at my instructor, employ weapons against him, call the kill, go back to base, celebrate, bragging rights for the rest of the week. That's what was supposed to happen. What actually happened? The fight started. I pushed the throttle up, lit the afterburner. I felt the jet start to accelerate. A few seconds later, I rolled and pulled back on the stick. I felt those 9 Gs pushing me down into the seat. And in that turn, I looked up through the top of my canopy at my instructor in the other aircraft. And I realized that the nose of my jet wasn't anywhere close to pointing at him, which is where it needed to be. So I pulled harder. As I did that, the first thing I was aware of is that my color vision wasn't quite as vivid as it normally was. And then quickly, the darkness began to close in till I was looking through a tunnel, and then a split second later, all I could see was blackness. Despite not being able to see anything at this moment, I could still hear. I could hear the rumble of the jet engine. I could feel the stick and throttle in my hands. And at that moment, I heard a radio call. Knock it off, knock it off. My instructor, looking over his shoulder at my aircraft, could tell that something wasn't quite right. So he made the call to end the fight. As I heard this, I had the wherewithal to pull back my left arm, the throttle. As I did that, the jet began to slow, the G's began to drop. A few seconds later, my vision returned. I was lightheaded. I was out of breath. I was confused what just happened, but I was okay. We ended that flight and headed back to base. So we did that. We landed, and we went into debrief. Debrief is something we did after every single flight. It's where we looked at what went well, in this case, more what didn't go so well, and how we could learn from it to get better for next time. As we pulled up the recording, the tapes from my cockpit, we began to watch the fight. I focused on the G's I was under and my Mach number, which is just another way to measure how fast you're going, with Mach 1.0 being the speed of sound. What I expected to see as that fight started and the jet accelerate is the Mach get to about 0.9 before I rolled, pulled, momentarily hit 9 Gs. Instead, I watched the jet accelerate, and holy cow, did it accelerate. I saw 0.9, then 0.95, 0.98, 0.99, 1.0, and I was still getting faster. I'm supersonic. I roll, I pull, I hit 9 Gs, and then I held it for a full 360-degree turn. Now I realize this all sounds really cool. 9G supersonic, woo, fighter pilot stuff. Not only was I going so fast, I could never turn tight enough to point at the other aircraft, but I was a split second away from G-locking. I had pushed the throttle up, lit the afterburner, then become fixated on everything else I needed to worry about, and not modulated power once during that entire fight. And when it comes to a G-lock in a single-seat fighter aircraft, if I'm not flying the jet, no one is. I have lost friends to that exact mistake. I was embarrassed by my performance, and more than that, I was scared by what almost just happened. And I went home that night, and I remember this like it was yesterday. While I was waiting for my dinner to cook, I sat on my kitchen floor and I cried. I had worked so hard to get to this spot, and now that I was there, I was not good enough. This feeling only got worse as we got into the more technical and complicated missions. I constantly felt in over my head, and like at any second, people were going to realize I didn't deserve to be there. And there was this disconnect between who I was as a person and who I thought I had to pretend to be in this type A fighter pilot culture that I didn't really understand. I had to prove myself. I couldn't show weakness or vulnerability. So when I had a question, I wouldn't raise my hand and ask it because I didn't want everyone else to realize how little I knew. And when opportunities would come up, chances to learn and grow in my new career, I avoided them because they came with a chance of failure and being found out. So while that flight that day earned me a cool sounding call sign, MACE, which is an acronym, it stands for Mach at Circle Entry. It's pilot jargon heavy, but it's an ode to breaking the speed of sound on that flight. That first assignment, those 3 years, I was miserable. And that was not at all how I imagined my career starting. As happens in the military, my time in Japan did come to an end, and I was off to my next base, Fort Worth, Texas. This physical change of an environment acted as a catalyst for me to wake up and realize just how unhappy I was with where I was at as a pilot, as an officer, and even as a person. And it suddenly dawned on me that no one was coming to save me, that it was up to me to change the situation that I was in. And this new squadron that I joined had an environment I hadn't experienced before. They had created an incredible culture of trust. This was a very experienced group of pilots, so they were confident in their skills, but they had nothing to prove. So arrogance was not welcome. And when someone made a mistake, it was looked at as an opportunity for everyone to learn from, not as an opportunity to shame and ridicule that person. And I began to thrive in this environment. So kind of this combination of this new environment and this wake-up call allowed me to make a decision. I decided I had enough of pretending to be something that I wasn't. I was going to start showing up to work just as myself, authentically, bringing the strengths that I brought to the team, even if they didn't look exactly the same as everyone else's. And it was right about that time as I joined the squadron that I made a promise to myself. I reflected back on those first 3 years and I realized how many opportunities I had let pass me by because I was afraid. So I made a promise that I was going to start saying yes to those opportunities that I felt called to go after, that I knew I should go do, even when they scared me. So this sounds good on paper, but you don't just decide that and then suddenly change overnight. It takes time. I started small. I started in my hobbies. There were all these things I had wanted to get into that had barriers to entry. I didn't have the skill set or the knowledge to go after them. I decided that now was the time to do it. So I started checking them off. I got into running marathons, technical mountaineering, and rock climbing. I even took a solo trip to Nepal and trekked to Everest Base Camp. And these bold decisions in my personal life started to give me confidence on the professional side. I got to deploy for the first time and finally do the mission I'd been training for so long. I was given the responsibility of teaching others as I became an instructor pilot. Each of these things on their own, seemingly insignificant, but brick by brick, they laid a foundation and built a runway so that when an opportunity did come by, I could launch myself and go after it. In 2017, I saw an email. The country of Poland was looking for American F-16 instructor pilots to spend the summer there teaching and flying. My initial reaction? I've never been to Poland. I love to travel. Also, their jets have all kinds of fancy features ours don't have. They're a heck of a lot newer. They probably still have new jet smell. Heck yes, sign me up. And then that little voice of doubt that I was so familiar with started to chime in. When I saw this email, I had been certified as an instructor pilot for 3 days, literally that same week. Any other instructor in my squadron, more experienced than I was. And Poland had never had a woman fly their F-16s. I didn't know that much about their culture. How would they react? Would they welcome me? Would they take instruction from me? And then it was like I was seeing this internal conflict all of a sudden from a third person perspective. And I realized that that promise I had made to myself and those intentional, bold choices I had been making for the last 18 months leading up to this was so I could say yes to an opportunity just like this one. So I went to Poland. There were times I wished I was more experienced, and there were cultural barriers to navigate. And it was one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. I started to see a pattern that when I said yes to those opportunities that I felt called to go after, whether that's in my heart or my head, I knew I should go do, but that also scared me, the rewards were the greatest. And it was this lesson of making bold choices and going after scary things that gave me the courage to even consider applying to the Thunderbirds. Applying to the team is intimidating, to say the least, and there was a good chance I would fail, that I wouldn't get hired. But I did get hired and went on to have 3 years of absolutely incredible experiences that would completely change what I would go do with my life. And the biggest thing I learned is that the key to progress is having the courage to start something when you're not ready, but believing in yourself enough to know you will figure it out along the way. And if you wait for the perfect scenario until you feel 100% ready, your progress will slow to a crawl. So I'm going to ask all of you to be a bit vulnerable for a second. No matter where you're at right now, unless you're driving, don't do this. I want you to take your hands, place them on your chest, and close your eyes. No one's going to sneak up on you. If you have a cat, I can't guarantee that. But I want you to think of something you've been wanting to go after. Some opportunity that you keep thinking about, it keeps coming up in the back of your mind, but you haven't done it yet because you're scared, because it comes with a chance of failure. This could be in your personal life, your professional life, whatever it is. I'm going to give you a second to think of one specific thing. All right. Hopefully that was enough time for everyone to think of something. Now, internalize whatever you just thought of. Don't forget it. We're going to come back to those in a minute. In Daniel Pink's book, The Power of Regret, he discusses how we are so much more likely to regret things that we didn't do versus things that we did do. Inaction versus action. And when it comes to professional regrets, the most common one, not being bold, playing it safe and not making bold choices. And when you're not willing to be bold, you can leave a lot on the table. I have one more little story for you. About 4.5 years ago, I just moved to Las Vegas, which is where the Thunderbirds are based. I still live here today. I was single and on the dating app Bumble. Anyone familiar with Bumble? You don't have to self-identify. What's unique about Bumble, you get matched up. There's always one. You get matched up with someone when you both show interest. So you both swipe right, you get paired up. But only the woman can send the first message. And she has 24 hours to do that, or that match disappears forever. They're trying to encourage people to be bold and take action. So I had matched with this guy that I found very attractive. So attractive, in fact, I was sure he had accidentally swiped right on me. So this idea of potential rejection, my inner voice of doubt and we didn't like that. That felt uncomfortable. So we made an agreement. We're just going to let that match time out and wait for someone uglier to come along. Just before that was about to happen, I got a notification. He had used an extension where you could pay extra to make that window of time longer. Okay. Well, that bolstered my confidence just enough. Now on my profile, it said Air Force pilot, but no further details. So I sent him a message, and I have been trying so hard to remember what I said to him first. And I can't, but I am sure it was incredibly clever and witty. I do remember what he said to me. He opened with, "Hey, what do you fly in the Air Force?" To which I proudly responded, F-16s. His reply, "Huh, I prefer the A-10. What? This is not the response I was used to or expected. And if anyone doesn't know, the A-10 is another Air Force inventory aircraft. I'm sure this group is pretty familiar. We have a friendly rivalry. So after initially being taken aback, I was curious. So we went on a first date. Turns out he had been in the Marines. He had a reason to be partial to the A-10 since they specialize in supporting troops on the ground. So that guy that I was too afraid to message, he and I actually have been married for 4 years. Tomorrow is our anniversary. Yay, I love how everyone's clapping. What was the worst case scenario of me sending a message? He ghosts me, which is all the rage these days. Or worse, he does respond and he says, "Oh, sorry, I accidentally swiped right. I accidentally used an extend. I'm really just not good with technology. And oh, by the way, I'm not interested. My feelings get hurt." Putting ourselves out there is terrifying, but if you can get comfortable stepping to the unknown and realize that worst case scenario you're imagining in your head is almost never reality, all sorts of possibilities arise. Creating this mindset of saying yes to opportunities, being okay with a little bit of vulnerability, and being primed to make bold choices, it takes time. It takes intention and it takes practice. But if I can go from nearly G-locking in the jet and think I would never be a decent fighter pilot to flying upside down at 100 feet in front of millions of people with the Thunderbirds, you can change how you feel about failure and what you see as your potential. So I really love speaking to groups like this because I think there are so many parallels for women in primarily male-dominated career fields, no matter what the job actually entails. I think there's this temptation to change yourself, to conform, to be like everyone else. For me, to be one of the guys, to be a bro, if you want to put it in the slang. And personally, I found that this led to a lot of internal conflict between what felt kind of right and authentic to me as a person and what felt like would allow me to fit in easiest. And so I struggled with that early in my career in the time I told you about in Japan. And so I think no matter your role or your experience level, You can find yourself having days where self-doubt creeps in. You can have days where you're unsure of the right answer, where you need to lean on the people around you, and even moments where you question if you belong. And when those days come, I challenge you to adopt this mindset, to start to associate that feeling of vulnerability with one of possibility, to be bold and to be brave. As you start to make one bold decision after another, doors will open to opportunities you haven't even imagined yet. And with time and repetition, you gain momentum. And before you know it, you're unstoppable. And I realize that sounds really cheesy, but I'm serious because with time and repetition, it becomes a habit. And it goes from just something that you occasionally do as a person and as a company, and eventually it becomes who you are. So that thing you thought of earlier that your heart's been calling you to go after, now is the time. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing, Michelle. Amazing. I'm sure many of us are still processing your amazing story and all of those nuggets of wisdom. Amazing. I'm going to take us to the Q&A section. And if you guys have any questions, please be sure to get them in. I'll start with the first one that I received, and it came from Veril. And his question is, what was your biggest fear and how did you overcome it?
I love that question because I think people see the photos and the videos or they see the show in person. They're like, ooh, your biggest fear had to be like physical injury, right? Death. But it wasn't that. It was for sure failure. It was failing publicly and being judged by everyone. That was my greatest fear. And I think so many people can relate to that. And that was something I struggled with early in that first assignment, which kept me from putting myself out there because that increased the risk of failing. Um, and how I overcame that was kind of just to gain perspective on it and be like, okay, I am really getting in my own way right now. And now I have a few more concrete techniques that I use to deal with it because I've even struggled as a new speaker with imposter syndrome. Like, cool, I'm good at flying airplanes, but who am I to stand on a crowd in front of thousands of people and talk? Like, that's two different skill sets. And I've kind of asked myself, what is the actual worst case scenario that could happen versus what is the actual reward that could come out of it? And I think a lot of times when you say what the worst case that you're kind of getting hung up on is, or you write it down, you share it with someone, it takes away the power of it. And you realize, much like my Bumble story, that you're kind of letting something that A is pretty unlikely to happen, and B, even if it did happen, you could plan for it in advance and handle it. You're letting that thing get in the way and keep you from going after things. So I take a very intentional approach to it now to really reflect. And then I don't want to spend too much time on one answer, but one other thing I use for that is I think about when things did go wrong in my past, and almost every single one of those, there's a silver lining that came out of it. Even if at the time it seemed terrible, I'm like, oh, well, that caused me to pivot to this. And that led me to these amazing people I would have never met, or this opportunity, or if nothing else, I grew and I learned from that time. So I think when you realize that even when things do go bad, there's a lot of good that comes from it, you're kind of more willing to accept those risks.
Thank you. And just so you know, the chat line is blowing up. Everyone is saying you're amazing. I've got one more question, and that's for all of the logical people that won't admit they're experiencing fear. How do you recognize when fear is masking itself as something else, and what do you do to work through it?
That's a good one. I think just like laying out how fear can show up, like that self-doubt that can kind of creep into that self-sabotage that can show up as, limiting yourself from setting goals that are actually challenging, or it could be procrastination. I feel like that's such a big one. We get afraid of like maybe the thing we're going to go do isn't going to be that good. Maybe I'm not going to be as good as other people expect me to be. And so instead of just tackling it, we just, push it off, and then you have that thing hanging over your head. So I kind of try to recognize when I'm doing that and figure out ways to prioritize. And the thing that I've found that always makes me feel better is just taking action, right? Like when you're dreading something, it's hanging over your head, whatever it is, if you just take some sort of action, even if it's small, to move towards progress in that specific area, all of a sudden you're like, okay, cool. Look, I did that fine. We made some progress. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with the term Sunday scaries, like where you're anticipating Monday and you're just like, oh gosh, you're like ruins half your weekend because you're not present with your family. You're just dreading some work task you have the next day. And I think for me to tackle that, I always just take maybe 30 minutes on my Sunday and I make a list of my priorities for Monday. I look at my time, my schedule. I'm like, okay, I want to work out at this time. This is when I have to be ready to go for the day, all of this. Just taking that intentional time to lay out like kind of a game plan. The Sunday scaries are gone. I'm like, okay, I feel prepared for that. And now I can get back to being present with my family. And so I think there's some like really intentional little techniques you can use to just recognize it and not just kind of live in the discomfort of being scared of whatever's coming up.
Amazing. And maybe we can take one more question. So I've got this one from Joey. And the question is, what best memory do you have pertaining to your team pushing you to overcome your fears?
Oh, that is such a great question. There's a lot. So I think a few moments where I would kind of struggle silently if I was, dealing with a little imposter syndrome or self-doubt, even on the Thunderbirds where I felt like I had pretty good perspective and I learned a lot about it at that point. And kind of those moments where someone just out of the blue would be like, there's one specific. There was another pilot on the team that was flying with me that I really respected. I respected all of them. But we would just, do the job. We give each other feedback. We'd, talk about when you had a good maneuver or whatever, like looked good. That formation looked great. Those kind of compliments were fairly standard. But he pulled me aside one day in the office and he's like, hey, I realized that you're under a microscope. I was the only female pilot for the 3 years I was there. So I realize you're under a microscope and you get a lot of pressure to always be like outgoing and personable and meeting with people. Like people would flock to me when we were out in the public. And sometimes the guys could just fade away. And I would just be like stuck there, which was rewarding, but also exhausting at times. And he's like, I think you're doing a great job. I know you struggle with that. And also watching you take over as lead solo and like teach the new opposing solo, you're a really good pilot. And no one had like just pulled me aside and said something like just a broad compliment like that. I was like, oh, the Calypso looked good today. You're like, cool. I've been working on that maneuver for 5 months now. But to have someone kind of take just a second, 30 seconds to be like, hey, I see you. I see the unique challenges that come with your role. And I think you're doing a good job. I mean, that was 2.5, 3 years ago now. And I still remember that conversation.
That's amazing. Okay, I'm going to hand it back over to David. But thank you, Michelle. Thank
No,
you.
thank
So
you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I'll turn it back to Mark for some final comments. Mace, just maybe one question for me. Did you find it hard to transition, from regimented kind of Air Force kind of protocol into civilian life? And then do you still fly, 182 or a Cirrus, or do you still get out and fly post kind of retirement?
No, I love that question about the transition because that was a huge pivot. And I kind of went an unexpected path as far as most people would consider. Most Thunderbird pilots either stay in after they leave the team till they get to 20 years of retirement, or they go fly for the airlines. Those are kind of the two common paths that people take. I actually found the transition to be really amazing. And I think I realized I was in a unique spot with a lot of opportunities that not every transitioning service member has. But I think it was because I really recognized while I was on the Thunderbirds, it became clear to me fairly quickly that those inspirational moments I got to have with people, especially the ones with little girls, where I could kind of see like a light bulb turn on. And it was just this look on their face where when they realized that I had just flown that jet that was just like in their face at this air show, their view of what was possible for themselves in the world expanded. And that was the most rewarding thing I had ever experienced. And I think I kind of got addicted to doing that for people and I wanted to figure out how to keep doing it. And so it became such a passion that the flying quickly became secondary to that. And so finding a way on the civilian side where I could continue to do that through speaking and writing, and like my children's book that's coming out soon. I just loved it so much that I think I was really driven, and I just created a regimen for myself. I was still working all the time and still kind of running my routine of a morning workout, doing all the things. So it actually has been pretty good, and I've really loved kind of transitioning to the next chapter. And then as far as flying, I've taken a break. I think I needed a cooling off period. I loved aviation and I love flying, and I really loved it initially, but it got to a point where it was such a grind and there was just so much pressure, such an intense environment that it was stressful. And obviously with the Thunderbirds, one mistake can be catastrophic. And so operating at that level for 3 years straight, I was just like, I need a break. But I'm starting to get back into it now. I have to kind of learn the entire general aviation world. It does not translate as easily as you think.
No. It's a lot slower. 180 knots isn't like 550 knots,
Well, for sure. And like flying at untowered airfields and flying VFR, I'm like, is someone going to tell me I can take off? They're like, no, you just go. I'm like, wait, what? So I guess you talk about a regimen. It's been tougher to transition to the non-military flying and the general aviation space, which is a little bit more of the Wild West than what I'm used to. But I think I'm at the point now where I'm just there's starting to be some flying opportunities popping up, and I'm starting to get back into it slowly.
That's great. Well, let me just thank you again personally for your just very genuine, kind of, discussion today, feedback, and just very, very inspiring. I think, one takeaway or two takeaways. One is that, how your team inspired you by just giving feedback. I think we don't often take the time to compliment and encourage others, right? And I think the other thing is, like you said, how a single moment, like with a little girl, or can encourage them for a lifetime. And I think everybody on the phone can kind of take that away, is that we all have a chance to inspire others through our behavior and encouragement. And that's what this is all about, right? When you have somebody in your corner that can help you realize that, you can make it, you can do it. I mean, that gives you, almost all that you need to kind of push forward. So thank you again, Mace. You've just been wonderful. Really appreciate it. So Mark, any closing comments from you?
No, yeah, just I share the same sentiment, David. I mean, yeah, just an amazing, riveting story. I mean, just so inspirational. I mean, obviously for not just for women, but for all of us. So, thank you, Michelle. I mean, yeah, it was just very authentic, and just right. Again, just going into the weekend is just super inspirational. I was just floored by the stories and the message. And thank you for your service. Thank you, Tracy, Elizabeth, Daniel, Sue, Cheryl. I mean, thank you for all the folks who organized this. This is just the beginning, right, for Ascend, and so I'm proud to be a Malai, I think is what I'm called, and in supporting women, right, in this platform. So thank you, Michelle, and thank you for all of those who joined. This has been a great event, and you'll hear more from Ascend right in the coming weeks and months. Thank you all.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mace.
Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend.